Welcome again to the next session in the First Line Leader webinar series, Mindfulness, the Secrets to Building the Leader Competency of Emotional Intelligence. Again, we're so glad that you could join us. Today's facilitators are Tracy Hanlon and Ann Petrie, and I will introduce them now. Ann Petrie is a positive organizational development leader and writer with 20 years of experience driving performance improvement in organizations. She brings compassionate, innovative, and insightful energy to cultivate resilient, mindful, emotionally intelligent teams who improve their own, their clients', and their organization's performance and well-being. She is a contributing author on the forthcoming book, Advancing Relationship-Based Cultures, which will be published in 2017. Tracy Hanlon is a staff development specialist with a background in nursing education and management in various clinical specialties. Tracy is best known for her work in helping organizations develop transformative orientation, preceptor, leadership, and healthy work environment programs. Tracy's work is informed by the latest cutting-edge research available on adult learning theory, critical thinking, clinical decision-making, and the science of well-being and resiliency, which looks at how positive emotions impact an individual's ability to engage in pro-social behaviors. I'd like to welcome Tracy and Ann, and I turn the presentation over to you.
So, good morning, everyone. We are going to dive into and explore the science of mindfulness and how it can help us in our everyday life, but also in our work life. So understanding the role of mindfulness and how it plays into developing emotional intelligence, which happens to be one of our number one leader competencies. We're going to explore how mindfulness improves our leadership skills, not only by making us more efficient and productive, but also by tapping into areas of the brain that engage us in positive emotions and equals happiness, as the research talks about. We'll review a lot of studies, and Ann and I are going to walk you through what's the science behind mindfulness. We used to think that this was you'll hear the word woo-woo term, but now we know that it's got some hard neuroscience behind it, and it's not only science that backs up how we use mindfulness, it's science that we can actually see now because we've advanced technologically and we have some hard evidence that supports some of the practices we're going to introduce you to. And then Ann's going to help us dive into examples of organizations that have really taken the lead in providing mindfulness courses and practices to their employees and discuss how companies like Google actually have used it and how it's impacted their workplaces and their employees. So let's go ahead and move on to the next slide. And before we get into the content, since this is a webinar on mindfulness, let's just take a minute to stop and let's center our attention, directing it to be fully present as we explore how something as simple as training our attention can make us more efficient, productive, and as research tells us, even happier. So before we get into what mindfulness is or isn't, I'd like you to really commit to being fully present. So turn your cell phones off, turn your email off, and just open yourself to an experience that I think you're going to find really enjoyable. And to help center our energy, I'd like you to get comfy in your chair. You might want to close your eyes just to avoid distractions. And I'm going to have you take a couple of deep breaths in. And this will be your first experience in a very, very simple mindfulness practice. So go ahead and take a deep breath in and out. And again, a really big deep breath in from the diaphragm and all the way out. And as you continue breathing, I just want you to notice what you're feeling right now. Any tension, let it go. Any to-do or task list, let it go. And take another couple deep breaths in and out. And when you're ready, open your eyes. And what we've just done is take a couple of mindful breaths. We've directed our attention to our breath, and later we'll be running you through some exercises that don't take a lot of time, but what they do is they help direct our attention and train our attention in ways that if we do it regularly enough, we can access in a way, in a moment that helps us be more productive in our chaotic, stressful life. So I'm going to turn it over to Anne for a moment. And well, actually, before we do that, let's go on to the next slide. Why is mindfulness a big thing now? Why all of a sudden is everyone talking about multitasking and how that's not productive, and how do we relieve stress, and why is it getting so much attention? Well, stress happens to be a $300 billion problem in the US alone. We know that 83% of employees report work as a primary source of stress. We also know that 50% of employees that have been surveyed say stress is overwhelming or a huge contributor to why they call out sick or lack of productivity on the job. 33% of employees are suffering from insomnia alone, with significant impact to their performance. And here's an interesting one to me. 83% of 2014 health cases, and I'm assuming that's health cases reported, are due to employee depression, stress, and anxiety. The reality is that we are bombarded by too many demands, an increase in our ability to have to multitask through complex situations in our healthcare environment. And that has an impact not only on how we do our job, it has an impact on us personally. And so we're going to take a look at, as leaders in this craziness, how do we mitigate that? How do we use what we know to not only change our practice, but change our way of interacting with stress? Because stress isn't going to go away. We know that 91% of workplace injuries are due to human error, and that's consistent with a lot of the research that talks about fatigue, not only just physical fatigue, but compassion fatigue. And when we're dealing with stressful environments, we have less capacity to not only perform in a physical way, but also to perform in a cognitive and emotional way. And those two categories are required if we're going to communicate effectively, engage people, and motivate our staff. So let's take a look at what some of these stressors are. Anne's going to talk to us a little bit about this more in depth.
Yeah, so Tracy, I think a point that you just made is really critical, and I'm going to repeat it because I think it's really the crux of what we are addressing today, and that is that stress is not going to go away. In fact, change is in many ways accelerating as we live through this technological revolution. And healthcare organizations have even adopted the VUCA language, which is actually, a Department of Defense term for the war zone environment, and that is volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity are kind of the norm now. And so what you described is that stress is not going to go away, but our relationship to it can change. And that's really the heart of what we're talking about today. And why I think Tracy and I are so passionate about this topic is our firsthand experience of learning and wishing that someone had taught us these skills, because they are skills that you can learn to manage stress and to manage your attention and focus in a way that builds optimism and resilience. So that's why we're so excited to be with you guys today. So, if you have kids or a husband or anyone, that you try to interact with, you recognize that if they're holding a smartphone in their hand, chances are you're feeling a disconnection because most often people are interrupted in the midst of conversations even. And data shows us that clinicians are interrupted on average every 2 minutes, and it increases our risk of error. And let me point out that we're not just talking about interruptions from other people or our smart devices. These interruptions can be from our own chattering mind distracting us. And then I want to tell you about this really fascinating study that we call the cell phone study. And I think everyone should become aware of it because it's really says a lot about the importance of being able to regulate our attention. There was this huge study of 2,000 people done, and it was reported in the journal Science. And basically, they had 2,000 people download an app on their smartphone. And what they did throughout the day with these 2,000 people is they asked them, okay, so how are you feeling right now? So they asked them a feeling question. How are you feeling right now? And rank it on a scale of 1 to 100. And then they asked the next question, what are you doing right now? And they had an option to choose one of 22 activities. So it could be sleeping, working, playing, cooking, whatever. And they logged in the activity they were involved in. And then they asked them, are you thinking about something other than what you're doing? So if you're cooking, are you thinking about cooking or are you thinking about something else? And whatever you're thinking about, is it pleasant, neutral, or unpleasant? And what they learned, which is totally fascinating, is that people's minds were almost never focused on what they were doing. In fact, more than half the time they were, or almost half the time they were not paying attention to what they were doing. And this to me is the clincher that I think is so relevant for us as leaders. People often, when their minds are wandering about things that they are worried about. So we don't often, when our minds wander to things that are exciting or hopeful or pleasurable. We're often worrying. And so what that says to us is a lot of the times our staff and ourselves are distracted and worried. So then consider this, that our attention span is dwindling. This is another thing to consider as you're hiring new staff and just observing the workplace, noticing what people's ability to hold attention is. And it's kind of startling and a little scary that currently, or in 2013, our attention span was less than that of a goldfish. So what's the solution to all this? And we alluded to it in the objectives. Essentially, stress is not going to go away, but we're living through this massive human experiment called the technological revolution, and it is important for us as human beings to also evolve. And part of the evolution is going to require us learning skills to address and adapt to the increasing stimulation of technology. And many, top-notch companies are onto this already, especially those that are filled with knowledge workers are really recognizing that they need to get ahead of the curve and figure out how to help their staff manage the overwhelming amount of information and stimulation coming at them. And so what is really exciting is that there's this confluence of things happening in the world of emotional intelligence, neuroscience, and mindfulness in helping us to understand how we can be more effective in the workplace. So let me just give you an example, and this is kind of a really relevant example. Duke, Brian Sexton at Duke, has been speaking a lot about mindfulness and intention regulation, emotion regulation, as it relates to patient safety and to staff resilience. And if you've had the benefit of hearing him speak, it's very compelling. And of course, Google is probably the most prominent, but Target, which is in the backyard of our home office in Minneapolis, St. Paul, is also embracing it. And Harvard Business Review did an entire issue on leadership and the importance of focus leaders based on Dan Goleman's latest book. So it's definitely something that in healthcare we need to really embrace and understand. So our request to you is don't listen to us, be skeptical, but see for yourself as we do some of these practices. Notice in your own mind and body what the impact is. And so we'll be talking about this confluence of emotional intelligence, mindfulness, and neuroscience. But let's start with emotional intelligence. It's something that's a concept that's been around for a while, since at least the early 90s, and it was really made popular with Dan Goleman's book, The Emotional Intelligence, which you may have seen. And let me just share a little bit with you about what is emotional intelligence, just to demystify it a little bit. This is a framework that was developed out of really millions of data points of working with companies around employers who were outstanding performers. And what they noticed is that the key components of outstanding performance were grouped into 4 clusters. And those 4 clusters are self-awareness, which is essentially the ability to understand your internal kind of weather patterns of mood and mind. So self-awareness, accurate self-assessment, and self-confidence. So those are kind of the big buckets of self-awareness. Self-management gets at the ability to regulate your emotions, to be trustworthy, to be conscientious, take initiative. So those are some self-management kind of competencies. And then social awareness, so important to us in healthcare. The hallmark of social awareness competency is the ability to take the perspective of another person, to be empathic. And then relationship management, the last one, also so critical for us as leaders, has everything to do with the ability to manage conflict with others, to communicate clearly and effectively, to catalyze change, to develop others and influence others. So these, interestingly, these 4 kind of buckets of competencies, or this framework, has also a neurological substrate. So these also relate to areas in the brain. And that's where Tracy's going to kind of talk more with us about why emotional intelligence, mindfulness, and neuroscience kind of come together in this interesting sort of mix. So before she does that, let me just share, if you haven't figured out already, research is telling us that exceptional leaders have learned about emotional intelligence, are demonstrating these competencies, and it's impacting their performance. It also is critical to our life and our well-being and our relationships with our family members and others. And it's at the heart of positive organizations, which is something that creative healthcare management is passionate about. So.
All right. Well, thanks, Ann. So we're going to introduce, building on what Ann has just talked about, how. We've talked about why. Why is it important? And intuitively, I think we can all resonate with all of the things that Ann talked about and recognize the importance. And it hasn't been until recently that we've started to look outside the box of our toolkits to realize that we need different tools to be able to manage this technical revolution, if you will. And so one of the concepts that's gaining a lot of attention is something called mindfulness. Now, when you think about mindfulness, there's a lot of different ways you can think about mindfulness. And just hearing that word, you probably bring your own interpretations or experiences of what you think mindfulness is. And I was really fascinated by how simple the practices of mindfulness are. One of the ways I think about mindfulness is as a way to train our attention to increase our ability to focus. And that's by engaging in something I call contemplative practices. And these practices engage the parts of our brain that are responsible for higher level thinking, basically our prefrontal cortex. And we know this because we have different science now. We're actually able to see the different parts of the brain and how the parts of the brain light up under I just had a brain loss there, imaging. And so actually, and if you could go back one slide,
Okay.
I want to bring up the definition of mindfulness. And this is by John Kabat-Zinn, who actually developed and was the primary researcher at looking at how mindfulness affects the brain, not just functionally, but actually structurally as well. And his definition of mindfulness is the awareness that arises from paying attention on purpose in the present moment, non-judgmentally. And so when I hear that definition, I had to really break it down, and I think about it in the sense of, again, that term, contemplative practices. Practices that engage our brain in a way that helps me get out of that stress-centered place. We'll talk about that a little bit more, and into that place in my brain that's responsible for higher level thinking. And there are many ways that we can do that. When I first heard the term mindfulness, I thought about, meditating for hours on end. And I thought that there's no way that I'm going to be able to do that. I'm not a meditator. It doesn't work for me. But as I learned more about what mindfulness or contemplative practice really is, I began to think of it in dedicated practice, which is more the solid meditative type style, and integrated practices. Basically, how do we operationalize practices that get us into our prefrontal cortex in our day-to-day. And when we think about the brain, we used to think that the brain had limited capacity to learn new things. By a certain age, we weren't really able to engage new concepts or develop new ways of thinking. It's kind of that adage, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. We now know that that's not true, and the science behind that is called neuroplasticity, which we're going to talk about a little bit later. But when you're thinking about how do you develop a mindfulness practice, I like to use the analogy of the gym. You go to the gym if you're into weight training or even cardiovascular fitness, and if you went once a year, you wouldn't get much benefit from that. You might get some benefit that day, but you wouldn't get the effects of weight training with increased muscle mass or increased cardiovascular performance. So you have to have a dedicated practice. You have to go 3 times a week and continue that to gain that benefit. It's similar with mindfulness. What the research is telling us, and you can go ahead and go to the next slide in, is that our brain is able to form new neural connections. And we do that by repeating certain experiences or certain thoughts or certain actions. Because every time we think a thought, an electrical impulse is sent to our brain along a certain path. And if it is a thought that is calm and it's centered out of our prefrontal cortex, then those neuronal passages grow. If it's a thought that is based out of stress and fear out of our amygdala, which we'll talk about a little bit later, then those neuronal passages grow. So interestingly enough, we looked at some some science behind this. And what we learned was how you pay attention and what you pay attention to actually can change the structure and function of the brain, which supports developing, as Anne talked about, emotional intelligence. So our brain naturally cycles through states of awareness. And as Anne depicted in the cell phone study, 40% of the time our brain wanders and we're not focused. So a mindfulness practice of simply reorienting our attention by using our breath as an anchor helps to strengthen those neural circuitries in our brain that allows us to focus. And the beauty of this, if you can see in this diagram, when they looked at how the brain functions when the mind wanders, you can see that that little red area, the lateral temporal cortex, which is close to the amygdala, lights up. And as we start to refocus our brain down in number 3, it's the prefrontal cortex that is mainly lit up. And it's in that reorienting, oh, I'm wandering or I'm distracted. Let me focus back to what I'm doing. And in this case, in this particular meditation that we're going to try here in a minute, you're refocusing your brain. And it's in that refocusing, that continual refocusing, that you start to build stronger neuronal processes that lead to that higher level thinking, or the prefrontal cortex. So simply by taking a few minutes in the morning or a few minutes in the evening, or even just refocusing on your breath for 4 or 5 breaths every day, strengthens our capacity to use that as a default way of coping. So rather than talking about it, let's let Anne run us through this, and let's give it a little practice.
Yeah, that's such a great sort of lead-in, Tracy, so let's experiment for a moment. And remember something really important Tracy said, and that is that mindfulness is not really kind of this blissed out state. Mindfulness is really what she described as the reorientation from distracted mind to present moment mind. So let's experiment and just, again, find a comfortable position if you can, and put your feet on the floor. You don't need to do anything fancy, but for a moment, either close your eyes or soften your gaze and tune into your body for a moment. Just notice the weight of your body on the chair that you're resting in. Notice where your body makes contact with the chair. Just feel that viscerally, not thinking about it, but actually literally feeling it in your body. And then gather the spotlight of your awareness and focus it on the breath. And wherever you feel the breath most prominently. So you might notice the breath at the belly. You might notice the belly rising with an in-breath, falling with an out-breath. And you may notice that it's really difficult to pay attention for one complete cycle of breath. You may notice that your mind is already wandering. And when you notice that your mind has wandered, gently but firmly escort it back to the attention, the focal point of the breath. Just allowing yourself to notice that the mind has wandered, not being carried off on a thought train, but you might even make a mental note, planning or anxious or thinking about the next thing I have to do, and then letting that go and returning back to the breath. And then gently, one or two more deep diaphragmatic inhalation and exhalation. Even noticing if there's sounds in your environment, that's okay too, because that is the reality of our life. Just noticing that there's sounds and bringing the attention back to the breath. And then gradually opening your eyes, coming back to the room. And what you just experienced was a moment of mindfulness. So let's just pause here and take a moment to see if anyone is willing to put a note in the chat about what they noticed, or if any questions came up with these practices or anything else that we may have talked about in the last 20 minutes or so.
Yeah, and I'd be curious to know what that was like for you. Some of you may have practices similar to this, but some of you may have never tried it in quite that way. So what was that like for you?
All right, while we wait for some more comments to come in, we did get one question, which is, what do I do when my mind is just spinning with thoughts while I'm trying to focus?
I love that. Want me to take that in?
Yeah, that's a good one. Go for it.
So that's a really good question, because our mind does that frequently. And that's when, as Anne mentioned, you choose a focal point. And when you notice that your mind is spinning out of control, you use that focal point to recenter and focus on that. So the breath is always with us. That's why we like to use that. And when I'm trying to focus on my breath and I notice I'm thinking about the laundry, or I notice I'm thinking about the next thing I have to do, I simply notice that and I just say to myself, okay, refocus. And then I take a deep breath in, and as I'm breathing in, I just pay attention to the sensation. What am I feeling? As I take a deep breath in, I notice that it's almost like a sigh. And so I notice everything particular about the breath in and the breath out. And then pretty soon my mind will wander again, and I'll just be gentle and go, okay, refocus, and back to the breath I go. So I may do that for a minute, or if I'm trying to be into a dedicated practice, I may do that for 5-10 minutes in the morning before I get up. So you choose something that you can center on. Some people need something more visual. I've had people tell me that they use a candle and they focus on the flame, and when they notice their mind wander, they bring their attention back to the subtleties of the flame flickering. But you're basically activating those places in the brain that have to bring you back to a focal point, which is your prefrontal cortex.
That's so great, because I think one of the big misconceptions is that we're only mindful when our minds are perfectly calm, like the usual visual image they use, which is like a calm lake with no ripples. I mean, that's certainly the goal or the hope, but more often we're much more like the rough sea with the turbulent sea. Our mind looks like that. And when we practice mindfulness, what we're doing is sort of going under the water and looking up at the turbulence. So we're in that calm space, observing the turbulence, but not lost in it. So our minds may never be completely still, but what we're doing is sort of stepping back from it and observing it, which gives us more space and takes us into that higher executive functioning. So Tracy, do you want to, that's probably a good segue to talk about the neuroplasticity.
Yeah, we talked a little bit about it, but I'll explain it a little more in detail. So neuroplasticity is the term for the science we talked about around now that we can see through imaging what is happening in our brain, we can actually see different neural connections get bigger and stronger, and other neural connections actually sort of shrivel up. And it's that analogy to working our muscles. The more you use a certain neural pathway, the bigger and stronger and entrenched it gets. The less you use the circuitry in a certain place of the brain, the less strong it is. And so when you think about our default actions, our default mindsets, when you are exposed to something that causes fear, your default reaction is to lean into it or to run away. Those are really established not by genetics so much, but by how we have learned to respond to things. And so when you think about populations, maybe as a child you learned to be afraid of a dog, and every time you had a bad experience, your default circuitry was to run away. Over time, you meet other dogs into your adult life and learn that, wait, dogs aren't so bad. I had a positive experience, and those parts of your brain light up. Over time, you can learn to hack the system, if you will. So neuroplasticity is the concept that we can change our brain to allow us to access our higher functioning as a default system rather than our survival default system, which is our fight or flight system, which comes from our amygdala. And the connection there that we want to think about is our fight or flight, our stress system, if you will, our sympathetic nervous system, is very fine-tuned for survival. So from an evolutionary perspective, it's a good thing that we have that response. Otherwise, we wouldn't have probably survived as a species. But the reality is it's almost too sophisticated, because our amygdala does not make the distinction between a true physical threat, such as a robber or a saber-toothed tiger or something that might eat us, to the threat of having a conflictual conversation with a colleague or going in to talk with a supervisor about a touchy subject. And so we are, as a society, on high alert, living out of our amygdala all the time. And that creates, like we said, the more you use it, the bigger it grows, default pathways that are not necessarily effective when we're working in groups of people. They are not necessarily effective to good communication or developing the skills of emotional intelligence. So when we think about how do we get an embodied cognition that uses mindfulness in a way that develops these strong connections in a different part of our brain, we have to develop practices that will strengthen those neural capacities. And so when we look at the prefrontal cortex, we engage our prefrontal cortex when we're making clinical decisions. We are engaging our prefrontal cortex when we decide not to send that email to that nasty coworker or that supervisor who doesn't treat us fairly. We are engaging our prefrontal cortex when we decide to pause and think about what we're about to say. But what happens is when we're under stress, which we are a lot, or when our attention is being distracted, and perhaps we have easier access, for lack of a better term, to our amygdala, then our amygdala, when it's confronted with any kind of threat or stress situation, can hijack our prefrontal cortex. And once our prefrontal cortex is hijacked, it is very difficult to get us back into a neutral state. So one of the ways we can do this is we can learn to engage our brain to be aware of what's happening in our body more frequently. So when our amygdala hijacks our prefrontal cortex, we are literally, our responses narrow. We are not able to think in a bigger and broader way. And we almost lose sight of what's happening in our body. But really, any kind of emotion is a physiological response. If we are feeling anger or fear, if you think about it, you will feel it in your gut, in your throat. Physiologically, what happens is your heart rate raises, your respiratory rate raises, and if you are used to being in touch with those physiological signals that your nervous system is sending you, then you can engage in a simple mindfulness practice such as focusing on your breath to give you a space to pause and get back online with your prefrontal cortex, where you can make better decisions, where you will actually say, nope, not going to send that email. Whoops, not going to say what I'm thinking in my head right now. And that really is the competency of emotional intelligence. So one of the ways that we can reconnect and strengthen that neural circuitry in the nervous system that allows us to be aware of those signals in the body early on is something called a body scan. And it's a simple meditation. You can do it in a minute. You can do it in 30 minutes. It can be a guided meditation where you actually listen to a voice guiding you through this, or it can be something you just think through. So let's go ahead and try it. Let's do a real quick center yourself. Again, get comfy in your chair. And I'm going to have you take a couple deep breaths in, and then just listen to the instructions of my voice. So with this next deep breath in, I want you to exhale, and I want you to sit firmly with your feet on the floor. And I want you to direct your attention to the sensations of your feet touching the floor. Is there pressure? Is there any tension? And as you start to notice the sensations in your feet, how comfortable you are in your shoes, or maybe you're not wearing shoes, let that attention roll right up through your ankles and into your calves, and notice how you're holding your legs. Are they crossed? Are they firmly on the floor? And just let every muscle go. For some of you, that may mean sitting back and letting your legs open a little. For some of you, it may mean uncrossing your legs. And as you become aware of the sensations in your lower body, I want you to let that attention roll up into your lower back and around through your back and into your belly. Many of us hold tension as we hold our stomachs in. Go ahead and let your belly soften. Just let it out. As you take a deep breath in, then notice your attention moving into your chest wall and up into your shoulders, where we hold a lot of tension, and just let it relax. You may want to put your arms down at your side and let it dangle. Take another deep breath in, and as you do, let that attention roll up into your neck and up through your forehead and down through your jaw. Take a big deep breath in, and as you let it out, just notice your entire body releasing and what that sensation feels like. And when you're ready, go ahead and open your eyes. So I'm curious if I would have asked you prior to doing that scan, and now after, if any of you noticed that you were holding tension in your body. And as we moved our awareness up into our body, how many of you consciously felt a release somewhere in your musculature?
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, Tracy, I did the practice as you described it, and I noticed that my shoulders were hunched up to my ears. And as you talked about the attention rolling up, it just gradually my shoulders dropped, and partly because I was intentional about it, but also I hadn't noticed that I was holding tension there. So that was interesting.
Yeah, and the great thing about this particular type of contemplative practice is that the more you direct your attention to what's going on in your body, and then you intentionally release a physiological response, you're strengthening the parts of your nervous system that are the same parts that send you really subtle signals in moments of stress. And so you strengthen those connections, and then in moments of stress, you're able to more efficiently recognize, ooh, my heart rate's up. I think my amygdala is being activated. And so you can engage your breath and recenter yourself and mitigate the process, that natural process of the amygdala hijacking your higher thinking centers. And that in itself is where we start to develop a better way of developing our emotional intelligence capacities.
That is so awesome. It makes me think of a story. So one of my volunteer roles is teaching teachers how to teach children mindfulness in the schools. And one of our amazing kindergarten teachers is teaching kindergartners about mindfulness in the brain, and they have a shortcut that they use. And like if one of the kids is upset, they'll say, "My amygdala has been hijacked."
That's exactly right.
I know, isn't that awesome? It's a way for the kids to say, you know, like, I'm upset right now, and I need to take a breath. And what they do that's really brilliant is whenever they line up to go outside or to lunch or to whatever, they, you know, all line up. And as they're exiting the room, they have a pause, take a breath sign. So that when they're all in their row, they pause, take a breath, and then they go. So I just think that's so cool. So let's put all of this together. It is, you know, a lot that we've covered in this 45 minutes, and we're just skimming the surface. As you can see, there's a lot of science that is pretty dense, both social science and neuroscience, and the practices themselves really require time and time and space to sort of experiment with them. But essentially, what, you know, if we were to connect the dots, what we're hoping that you all will take away is that self-awareness is, you know, foundational to emotional intelligence. In fact, Dan Goleman would say that self-awareness of all the competencies is the most critical for leaders to develop. And so that's why we, you know, in developing this First Line Leader seminar, thought it was so critical for us to bring this concept and practice forward for the leaders out there to begin to, if you're not already, or to advance the conversation about the importance of self-awareness and emotional intelligence and mindfulness as one vehicle to get there. There are others, but we're focusing on mindfulness here. And then emotional intelligence, as we said, are the competencies that distinguish good from great leaders. And to be able to be conversant with the language and the competencies will help us all in our role of developing young leaders. And then insight, which is, you know, the pausing to take a mindful breath, recognizing when our amygdala has been hijacked, being able to refocus and choose a wiser path. These are all the benefits of these practices, both formal and informal.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you went a little bit deeper into the competencies of emotional intelligence, because really what we've done in the last hour is introduce you to the basics, the very basics. And Ann and I are going to be putting together some more in-depth webinars in the future where we will go into more of the capacities around emotional intelligence and really break each competency down so that as a leader, you can start to think about, how do I want to grow my brain, literally? How do I want to grow my brain in a way that I can develop easier access to those thinking centers that are going to get you more efficient behaviors and thought patterns, and actually produce a calmer overall life, because those will be your default patterns. And so when we think about mindfulness in a whole, there's a lovely quote by Viktor Frankl, who was a survival in Nazi Germany of the concentration camps, and he was actually a psychiatrist. And he says, between stimulus and response, there's a space. And in that space lies our freedom and our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our happiness. And I love this quote because what it tells us is that our ability to make good choices around what we do and what we think and what we say, it's all within us. We just have to be able to train ourselves when our survival instincts kick in, when our amygdala takes over. We have to train our brain to do something different. And if we don't train our brain, it won't, because that nervous system is so ingrained from an evolutionary process. But it gives us hope, because it's that space between acting or stimulus and response. There's a space, and it's within that space that mindfulness really helps us.
That's great. So Tracy and I wanted to just send everybody off with some practices that they could experiment with. We're not going to go into these, but just know that they're in your handouts. Just a slide about trying mindful meetings, and then a 3 good things slide, which is from Brian Sexton's work at Duke. So with that, we will conclude.
Great, thank you, Anne.
Great. Well, we've had a couple more questions and comments come in. If people want to send in theirs, that would be great. Laura had asked, how much time should a person need to spend refocusing their mind?
Great question.
So Tracy, yeah, I can take that. So there's a couple ways to think about it. One is, and Tracy mentioned this, there are formal practices and informal practices. In the same way that you might think about exercise, you may have a formal running, practice where you go run every day. The research says that a minimum of 20 minutes a day, or you can see impact with 20 minutes. And partly that's because they haven't done much research on shorter practices, but certainly starting with 3 to 5 minutes a day is a really meaningful goal and achievable goal, and then building from there. And I would add that building in informal practices throughout the day, so pauses like when you're washing your hands before you go into a patient room or something like that, to become mindful and just check in with yourself. Those are all valid, meaningful ways to train your brain to refocus. So formal, and think of it as formal and informal. Do you have any other thoughts, Tracy?
No, I think that's a really good point. I don't know that meditating, well, actually the research does show that the longer you have a formal practice, and it's like anything else, the more you engage that neural circuitry, the better. However, what I have found in my own practice is that when I am feeling stress, and I'm so attuned now to when my body signals that, just taking a couple deep breaths and recentering and refocus allows me to engage my parasympathetic nervous system, which mitigates my heart rate, my respiratory rate, and that in that moment is very, very helpful. And then when I have time, I do try and do it in the morning and at night, but I know that I can access that in a moment, 30 seconds, a minute, and it's like anything else. The more I do it, the stronger that's going to become. So whether it's an integrated practice where I do it in the moment and it's just a small one, and then I go back to my dedicated practice. The more you can do it, the better. But as you're starting out, start slow. Start with a minute in the morning, and then just when you think about it, take a few pauses during the day and take some deep breaths and just notice how you feel.
Again, thank you again for joining us for the First Line Leader series. We hope you found this presentation of value. I want to thank you, Tracy and Ann, for joining us and presenting such a great topic, and also for the rest of you for taking time out of your busy schedules. We hope you have a great weekend, and we look forward to seeing you in January. Take good care now.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Tracy.
Thank you.